Welcome to Command and Control, a podcast series about military command and the control measures used to orchestrate combat engagements and wars. The show is sponsored by Systematic.
Systematic's world-leading command and control software, the Citaware Suite, is in use in 16 NATO countries and more than 50 militaries worldwide. Its open architecture allows complete integration with legacy systems while meeting all NATO interoperability standards, and its intuitive interface bridges language and domain barriers across alliances.
On the 4th of February 2025, Ukrainian President Zelensky posted on Telegram saying that, quote, the Commander-in-Chief also reported on the modernisation of our army. A corresponding plan has been approved for the transition to a new organisational structure of the armed forces of Ukraine and the creation of CORPS, unquote. Now, CORPS here is obviously CORPS, not CORE. And this is interesting because back in 2022, we talked about how the Ukrainian Armed Forces C2 was structured in a very different way to that which Western militaries might expect. The lack of divisional and echelon structures allowed brigades to talk direct to Army HQ, to task organise, enabled greater mission command, and enabled the prioritisation of very scarce levels of support held at high levels to be allocated to the most important fight from an operational level perspective. Now, since then, the emergence of operational strategic groups, operational tactical groups, and tactical groups demonstrated the ongoing requirement to morph and adapt for the fight that the Ukrainians were in, as well as the scale and spread of the fight. Since then, there have been tweaks and the emergence of a number of administrative headquarters in the rear. So this new plan, the arrival of CORPS, sounds like a recognition that a new level of command and control was required. The establishment of several new core HQs sounds very Western, but it doesn't exactly conform to the expectations of some military theorists and armoured generals. For one, there are no divisional structures beneath the core, so the devil is certainly in the detail. Now, Mick Ryan hosted an excellent Substack blog about this recently, and I immediately asked him to come on the show and explain. Most listeners will know of Mick and might recall that he was the first guest on this show way back when we talked about the quest for certainty. That episode remains one of the most downloaded conversations we've had. Mick is a strategist, a retired Major General from the Australian Army, and one of the most globally respected commentators on war today and what it bodes for the future. Importantly, for this conversation, he's a graduate of the United States Marine Corps Command and Staff College and the USMC School of Advanced Warfighting. Mick, welcome back. A huge pleasure to have you with us. Thanks for squeezing us into your diary. Can you start by giving us the headlines of this change and what it means?
Yeah, thanks. It's always a pleasure to be back here, and it's a great privilege to speak to you on a podcast that I listen to regularly and I think covers some very, very important issues. So I guess the headline is that in a nightly address a couple of nights ago, President Zelensky referred to a conversation that he'd had with the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, General Syrskyi, where they had discussed and he'd endorsed a restructure of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, which would, among other things, include the formation of more corps. We might note that when General Syrskyi was appointed a year ago, looking at the structure of the Ukrainian Armed Forces was one of the things he was told to do by the president, including looking at the headquarters, number of people in them and these kind of things. So this is Syrskyi not only responding to battlefield pressures, but also to that tasking a year ago from the president. They're not the first corps that the Ukrainians have formed. They formed several corps in the lead up to the 2023 counteroffensive. Those corps were never used as corps. They were committed piecemeal for a few reasons that we could go into if you want later on, but they never really realised a full potential of corps-level operations for the Ukrainians. So we'll see what happens. There's a lot of issues and challenges which we can talk about throughout the podcast.
Mate, that's useful. I guess the question that people would be asking, right, is why now? I mean, you've said, this is a response to some direction, but you also intimated there was some battlefield pressure. What does a core level structure give you? What does it enable you to do that you wouldn't otherwise be able to do if you operated with operational tactical units and tactical groups?
Yeah, I mean, these OTUs, tactical groups, this operational strategic groups are kind of ad hoc. I mean, there's no real standard approach. Depending on where you are on the battlefield, you get a different kind of headquarters. One of the problems with that approach, and I'm not sure whether the corps will resolve this, is they should have a bunch of enablers that support the manoeuvre, that shape the manoeuvre of subordinate organisation. It's not clear that they've fulfilled that role very well, if at all indeed. They should also provide a link between the General Staff and the brigades, but it's clear that General Staff often jumps over these headquarters because they feel they have to give direction. So I think the corps level headquarters, if the Ukrainians get them right, will provide a higher level of competent battlefield planning and leadership that will allow, first, the shaping of future brigade operations, the weighting of tactical operations in a more efficient and effective way, and hopefully for the General Staff to step back a little bit and worry about military strategic issues rather than jumping down into the tactical as much as it appears they sometimes do. So that's what the corps should offer them. Now, these corps will not look like the doctrinal corps of NATO, particularly those of the Cold War era, where you have 2 to 4 divisions, each of which with 3 to 5 brigades. They won't look like that. But that's okay, because this isn't the Cold War. A lot's changed with technology since then, and in some respects, what the Ukrainians are doing may offer some insights for many armies around the world that are really brigade-centric and won't be able to form lots and lots of divisions.
I guess the problem here, you intimated substack, and I wonder, going back to Napoleon's use of the corps back in 1800, is this really just a higher tactical level headquarters, or should it be doing something in addition? We evolved from this idea of a large combined arms unit that could fight, that contained artillery, infantry, and the support services, the enablers. It was a proper combined arms unit, cavalry in there as well, to do the full fight, right? That was the idea behind it. It became more of a coordinating function in some ways, but that allowed it to raise itself away from the current fight. It wasn't just looking at exactly what happened. That was the sort of evolution. The risk here with brigades going straight to corps is that they're simply going to be directing the current operations, right? They'll just be another tactical level headquarters. Sure, that will give the Army Central Command a chance to take distance, but again, it doesn't really add anything in an operational sense, right?
No, I think that's right. If all they do is rename these OTUs, OTGs, and call them corps, that is not a step forward at all. It's probably a step backwards, because you've got the same organisation, and the expectations of soldiers and junior leaders who wanted reform will be dashed. So it has to be more than that to be successful. My sense is, for the corps to be really successful, you probably still need some kind of intermediate headquarters between them and the General Staff. Now, the headquarters of ground forces might provide that, but, I'm not sure that's going to work, even though corps in their 20th century manifestations have moved on from just higher level tactical to joint integrators and these kind of things. My sense is there's still probably a level of command missing between what these corps might be and the General Staff.
And what about below them? I mean, this absence of a divisional structure, sure, it removes the sort of staffing level, but there'll be a temptation for corps level commanders and the Corps HQ to get down into directing fires, right? I mean, sure, they might need to prioritise the allocation of fires, but to get down into directing time on targets and stuff, surely that's not their role, right?
Only if it's part of shaping the future battle space, not running the current fight. They will need a lot of those kind of enablers, not just fires, but electronic warfare, higher level drone capabilities, logistics, and these kind of things that both shape and support the current fight. But the other thing that concerns me when you have so many brigades in a corps is, remember, in the Army, you talk about span of command, span of control, and generally brigades and divisions and even battalions generally have 3 to 5 somethings underneath them, because we know from thousands of years of history that human commanders, particularly when things get tough and dangerous, they get tunnel vision and only can focus on 3 to 5 things at a time. If you have a corps that has 7 to 9 brigades, it worries me that human capacity to focus only on 3 to 5 things, which is why we have divisions, might be compromised. So, I still think the jury's out on whether this really will be the solution, and span of control, span of command are really important issues that maybe in peacetime we don't see, but in wartime, boy, they're vital.
One of the great things about the Ukrainian armed forces is their fearlessness in adapting. So it excites me that they will see a problem with this, 3 minutes down the line and suddenly establish this stuff. But there's also, it comes into tension with the political directive, which I think was to reduce the number of people in headquarters, right? Get more people at the front line, sort out some of the problem with humans at the front line, too many in headquarters. So there's going to be a tension there naturally, right? Everyone thinks that headquarters should not be large because that's inefficiency. Actually, the reverse might be true in some cases.
Yeah, I mean, a corps headquarters actually is pretty big. Just because you've got to run 24 hours, that drives staff sizes. But the functions of a corps are, between planning the future fight, working with other corps, running the current fight, logistics, EW, fires, engineering, a whole range of functions means these can be pretty big integrating headquarters. I mean, I remember my time in officer training where you go through the doctrine of brigades and divisions, and even in Australia back then we were still thinking we might have corps. I mean, we did have a few in World War II. I remember the table of manning for a doctrinal corps was about 1,000 people. Now, I don't know whether the Ukrainians will do it this way, but there's still going to be large organisations if they're to do their job efficiently and effectively.
And all of that manpower, all of that horsepower, that intellectual effort is focused on the operational level, as you said, of doing future tasks, specifically around the shaping of the battle space and then exploitation, allocating resources and everything else. They're not really about the rear headquarters functions, some of the long-term supply aspects, the allocation of additional soldiers as they come to the front, the energization of conscription, all this sort of stuff, the training and all the rest of that stuff. That doesn't sit with corps headquarters. So I'm presuming that there will be other headquarters, the rear area ones, that will continue to function that way, right?
Yeah, I mean, this is, what field armies do, right? Is the entry to theatre, the throughput of reinforcements and supplies, the backflow of wounded and equipment to be repaired back in the strategic support base. So that, there's going to have to be something like that. And, whether that's the service headquarters, the ground headquarters, the National Guard headquarters, the Marine headquarters, or something else. I mean, I still have a sense that there's something missing between the corps and the general staff. I mean, this has been the one thing I've watched very closely throughout the war and have been increasingly discomforted by, because it's like, this is a real problem. Command and control is a crucial discussion for senior leaders. I mean, there's this old saying that amateurs talk tactics, professionals talk logistics. Well, that's rubbish. Professionals actually talk command and control. And in a big war like this, the efficient and effective command and control of combat units is a very serious undertaking. And it seems to be one of those undone tasks that the Ukrainian ground forces are finally getting around to.
And learning pretty fast, right? I mean, that's the reality. Your C2 solution has got to be context specific, but you've also got to be fearless in your willingness to change. It feels like, as a sort of observer with some perspective, that we're seeing this ability, this willingness to constantly change and churn. But that's got to have an impact on those organizations themselves. If you can't bed yourself in as a corps, you think you know what you're doing as a corps, suddenly you're told to do something else. It's quite hard to generate a group of people who can actually do those jobs in a very different way, right?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, change in any military organization is difficult under the most benign of circumstances, as you well know. Peacetime changes to organisations is tough. I mean, look at how the British Army has had to twist itself inside out in the consolidation of its regimental system and the formation of the adaptive force and then subsequent changes. These were really difficult political and institutional challenges. Well, in wartime, it's even harder. Even though there is an imperative to change more quickly, you're in contact with the enemy, and to change, you need to withdraw forces, reorganise them and throw them back in. So it takes a huge amount of courage to launch into these kind of changes in the middle of an existential fight for the Ukrainians. But then again, being in the middle of an existential fight provides part of the imperative for constant change, learning and adaptation for the Ukrainians, as it has from day one of this war. And It's one of the defining characteristics of not just Ukrainian soldiers, but Ukrainian people overall in this war is their willingness to take risk, to experiment, to change the status quo. And some of that can rub off on the rest of us. We would be very fortunate indeed.
Mick, I just want to dig in a little bit more, if we can, to some of the challenges, and in particular, the one about people and skills. So we talked a little bit about people and skills required in a core HQ are different. There are only a few schools in the world that provide those kinds of skills to people dedicated to training for a core level style of operations. That's one part of it. The other part is the commander. Finding the right commander is really difficult. Why is that?
Well, command of a corps is not like commanding a big brigade. You're thinking at a totally different level temporally. You're thinking at a totally different level with the integration of all the different kinetic and non-kinetic elements on the battlefield and beyond. You have to think much, much deeper physically. You really are engaged in the deep, close and rear fight in a very profound way. So it takes people who can think differently and provide the kind of outline guidance to a staff that high-level operations require. Indeed, President Zelensky, when he spoke about this just a few nights ago, talked specifically about choosing the right people to command these corps. And, it will take a pretty robust selection process to ensure it's not jobs for the boys. This is a pretty specific skill set. And it's the same with staff. I mean, this is why the US Army set up the School of Advanced Military Studies, while the US Marine Corps set up the School of Advanced Warfighting. I'm a graduate of it, so I have to say it's a much better institution, and it is a very fine institution. But, the COCOMs and corps commanders in the US Army fight for graduates from these schools because they give you a very different way of thinking and planning and interacting with different people. Design, planning and execution are three very different skill sets you need to master. And the Ukrainians are going to have to be able to provide this level of training. Now, I've spoken to those in charge of Ukrainian training, and they've worked very hard to improve staff training throughout this war, very hard indeed. And they've done it with their partners in Britain and Germany and the United States and elsewhere. But this is another skill set, and you can't just take a brigade S3 or G3 and turn them into a core G3 overnight. It takes some planning, preparation, training and development.
Just talking on that, I mean, I was always interested when the SAMS course used to come over to London every year. Well, I was at RISI, I used to be privileged to have an hour with them and talk to them about it. They were a very different set of people intellectually from the other staff courses you'd see. They genuinely were. And I don't mean that in a sort of derogatory way. They were bright, interested, sparky. But the questions they would ask were remarkably different from anything else you'd get. What does sort of core level education syllabus look like? I mean, stretch back your memory to your USMC experience. How do they get and generate this type of people?
You start with the politics. At the core level, you're much closer to the civil-military interface than you are at a brigade or a battalion or a company, and you need to understand the political imperative for military operations in a far more sophisticated and profound way than you do in previous 3 or 2 or 4 or 5 jobs. So you start with the political. Every military campaign has a political object, and you absolutely must understand that. You obviously get into then that interface, how that works, and then it's all about campaign planning. I mean, we did not only study multiple campaigns, but we were given week-long planning problems to plan campaigns, but do it through a historical framework. So we'd study the Napoleonic Wars for a few weeks. You'd read a book a day and do seminars, and then you'd have a whole week where you were told you are on Napoleon's staff, plan a successful invasion of Russia in 1812. Or you are on Haig's staff, plan a successful operational breakthrough in 1917. So you need to have a historical knowledge. You need to have an understanding of very sophisticated integrated campaign planning in multiple domains. And you need to understand how to do things and do them over and over very quickly, knowing that some will fail, some will succeed, but you're generally moving in the right direction of your campaign objectives. All these are very difficult. It's a full year of campaign planning. The SOAR course I did graduated in 03. I've served with every single one of those officers in Iraq, Afghanistan, or in the basement of the Pentagon since. It's a community that's tight, and you stay in touch and you continue to push each other's skills and capabilities throughout your entire career. Indeed, one of my classmates just retired as Chief of Defence Force in Canada. So these are the kind of people that go through these courses.
Clearly, Ukraine don't have the ability and the freedoms to send people off for a year of SAMs or USMC equivalents. They've got to generate this on the ground. I assume that that's essentially trying to pick the people they see with enough potential and then trial and error, right? So we're going to see some churn in these headquarters. We're going to see some of maybe the cream being drawn off from the brigade staffs and lifted up. So there's going to be a considerable amount of churn in there. The sacrifice in order to do that is quite significant. And therefore, the upside, the expectation of what they deliver must be significant as well, right? Did they find that by using the core structure prior to the counteroffensive in 23, that the core level delivered something that they hadn't expected, or did it drive efficiencies, or what are the opportunities that they're getting from this?
Well, I don't think they really saw the benefits of the cores that they developed for the counteroffensive. They were never committed as cores. They were largely committed piecemeal. There was never really large-scale concurrent operations, unfortunately. So they're really in a bit of a whole new world here, but clearly they believe that what they're doing at the moment isn't working from a C2 perspective, and they believe this is the solution. Now, I have to believe in the background there's been a whole lot of wargaming and testing of different options, and this is the best option. Heading back to the churn, absolutely. I mean, for example, the 3rd Assault Brigade, one of the most, effective, profoundly impactful combat formations of the war, of many, is now going to become a core. I mean, how do you split that kind of staff that has developed a method of battlefield success into something that's some will go to core, some will go to other brigades? That is going to cause some profound changes in that organisation. But clearly Sierski, his staff and his advisors believe that this is their only solution at the moment, and that might be part of it. They might think this is the only way ahead, not the best way ahead, but the only way ahead. I don't have any deep insights into that at the moment. I hope to get some at some point. But often big change comes about when there's been a significant failure, and maybe Sierski thinks, listen, we're on a pathway to failure with our current C2. This is the only way to stem that.
Mick, we've talked about a couple of the challenges involved in this, including the new level they've got to operate at, selecting commanders and finding the right people. What are some of the other challenges you hinted at in your post, some of the other issues that they had? Could you run us through some of those challenges that you think that might be experienced for any organisation going into this, but the Ukrainians specifically?
Yeah, I mean, I guess one of the things I looked at in that post was the principle of concentration of effort or concentration of force. A core should theoretically allow you to concentrate effort on a single objective or a single axis. It might not have every brigade working concurrently, but that concentration be able to undertake sequential brigade operations to maintain momentum for the core doesn't appear to be something that's done terribly well at the moment. A core should theoretically allow you to do that. A core should also help you achieve another principle of war, which is economy of effort, in that you have certain brigades on the front lines, certain ones preparing to be on the front lines, certain ones resting. So, it should help achieve with those kind of important principles of war, which have stood the test of time. There's a reason why they remain principles of war. So I often go back to the principles of war and say, well, will this help us do them better? And often the answer is yes, but that's not always the case. I think the other thing that is very interesting is that, maybe this is the future of doing concurrent integrated operations in a land domain where it's more about coordinating lots of brigades than divisions. That's a hypothesis, by the way. It's not a strongly held view, but it should help inform many European nations who have 3 or 4 brigades to look at, well, what's the structure of the division or high-level headquarters? Let's forget what we call it. But what is the structure, the functions, the enablers of a headquarters that oversees brigades and links into other nations' corps or divisions and up into more strategic and joint organisations. So this is also going to be a great big battlefield laboratory in some respects that we should all be watching very carefully.
And that's interesting for me because this is but one war. European militaries are obsessed by it. Lots of people, politicians and military leaders can't look at any other campaign except for Ukraine. And they're obsessing over it, drawing lessons from the immediate rather than having perspective. How much of this change in the C2 is immediately transferable to other institutions and organisations? How much of this is very context specific? So, for example, I know recent travels that you've done to other active campaigns and fights will have had different lessons of C2. Is there a danger that European forces particularly look at Ukraine and go, right, we need to reestablish corps, this is where we go, we get rid of divisions? Is there a danger in that? Is this very context specific, or is this widely transferable?
It's kind of a bit of both, right? And I'm not trying to give an intellectually lazy answer. But every lesson, I've written a lot about how do we translate lessons from Ukraine into the Pacific. So what every country needs to be doing is watching closely, but also have in mind the translation or filters that they require to turn Ukraine lessons into insights that are relevant for their organisation. Those filters will involve geography, terrain, weather, vegetation, alliance structures, their threat, what kind of enemy they're facing. So every single lesson from Ukraine is relevant, but every single one of them also have to be filtered through those translation devices for different countries. And for Australia, don't think we paid enough attention, but us, the Taiwanese, the Japanese, we're all looking at it, but we do need to have pretty defined filters so we can pass lessons like, drones, going to be different in the Pacific, but they're still going to be useful. And command and control will be another one like this. We need to watch it, we need to gain insights, but also pass it through our own translation filters.
I guess that's one of the interesting things that came out for me from the post, which is there's no single key lesson here, right? But it's about your willingness to adapt, evolve, to lead. It made me reflect on your post. Who drives this change? I mean, you said right at the start that Syrskyi had two things. One, he was required to report on it. Secondly, was pressure from the battlefield in many ways of success and failures. When you come to these really big changes, from the high level right to the low level in command and control, they tend to be caused by something, Goldwater, Nichols, all the big evolutions. They come back to a moment to think about driving them. European militaries, the victory by the Prussians at Sedan and then Metz caused a huge change in this organisation of the military. How do you recognise those moments, or do you think they're pertinently clear when they happen, like Sedan? Who orders them? Is it a political drive, Goldwater, Nichols, or is it a military internal self-examination from a defeat, usually, that says, we've got to change?
Once again, it can be either. I know that a lot of the most profound military changes have come from some kind of failure. You mentioned Jena Austerlitz was a massive driver for change for the Prussians, resulted in the modern staff college, for example, and a whole range of other reforms about recruiting, training, education, as well as the informal military society. So you right from then, you have the yin and the yang of the formal and informal development of officers and leaders in the military. Changes in strategy and military strategy can result from something like the fall of Singapore. For my country, that was a profound failure. We were part of it. It wasn't just the Brits' fault, even though we like to blame it on the Brits. It wasn't just the Brits' fault. But it resulted in a really significant turnaround in political and military strategy, including embracing the American alliance. So militaries, I think, generally are forced to change through some kind of failure, whether it's on the battlefield or an institutional failure like we saw in provisioning IED protection for troops in Iraq and Afghanistan. I think failure is the greater causer of change in military organisations than just about any other. And I think that potentially you could say, well, the 2023 counteroffensive and the problems we're seeing on the Eastern Front in Ukraine might be enough of a imperative for people to think we can't keep doing this. This is going to lead to an even bigger failure. We need to change. So I think failure is probably a bigger one. And, even Goldwater Nichols, that came from military failure, right? Grenada and Panama were joint failures for a whole range of reasons. They might have been successful operations, but boy, there were some fairly interesting failures that occurred that forced the hand of the politicians to say, listen, US military, you need to make some changes. And I think the best changes are the ones that are forced on the military from politicians sometimes, because the good thing the politicians can do, one, they're elected, so they have the authority to do that. But secondly, guess who actually has the purse strings? And they can tie change to resourcing. So that's a superior way of changing, even though bottom-up change can help inform and assist the implementation.
Now, I don't want to press you too much, and we're sort of diverting slightly from Ukrainian C2 here, but Israeli C2, in the face of two very different fights, north and south, has that had to evolve again for two very different types of warfare? Is there again a difference in the command and control apparatus they use from the north to the south? Have they done their own internal revolutions and machinations and adaptations?
C2 between north and south is largely the same, actually. It's battalion, brigade, division, regional command. So you're like Gaza division and a couple other divisions working in Gaza. In the north, you'll have 2 to 3 divisions under Northern Command at any one time. Northern Command or Southern Command become kind of the core level, integrating, planning, shaping organisation, not just in the ground, but across all the domains. Where you do see differences between the two is one is a more heavily mechanised and mounted operation in the south. In the north, it's not so much. It's far more dismounted. And that actually really surprised Hezbollah when the Israelis were dismounted rather than mounted. So what you're seeing is similar C2, but very different structures and types of operations being used. And I look at that and go, actually, that's what good militaries are supposed to do. They're supposed to have an arms rooms of ideas, tactics, and organisational constructs between mounted, dismounted, and stuff in between that they apply to different situations. So what I see is the Israelis doing what good militaries do, is just looking at the situation and pulling the right tools out of their arms room to conduct operations where they need to.
Mick, thanks for sharing and for sparing your time. I know the audience is really going to appreciate your insights, as do I. Mick has 3 books out at the moment: a novel, White Sun War, The Campaign for Taiwan. Then there's War Transformed, which many will have read, from 2022, and The War in Ukraine from last year. He's also contributed a chapter to the new book by Steve Leonard and John Klug called Professionals Talk Logistics, itself the topic of our next show. All are worth reading and have been exceptionally well reviewed. Now, you can also sign up for Mick's blog, Substack and weekly newsletter, including his Big Five, which provides the best reading on national security from the preceding week. In a world where everyone seems time poor and overwhelmed by information, it's the easiest way to stay abreast of events and opinions. The show is sponsored by Systematic.
Citaware is the world's #1 force integration solution, providing full C4 ISR capability across the globe.
We hope you enjoyed the show, as well as telling your friends and colleagues about it. Please do subscribe and leave us a review on any of your usual podcast streaming platforms. This helps us to reach new audiences and spread the word. The episode is produced by AureliusThinking.com as a show for the Waiver Room, the home of intellectual curiosity and challenging thinking for military professionals everywhere. Thanks for listening.